Hello there, dear listener. Tonight, we're embarking on a gentle journey back through time to a place that existed long before our modern comforts. We're going to explore the real American frontier, not the version you've seen in movies with heroic cowboys and dramatic showdowns, but the authentic, lived experience of ordinary people trying to make their way in an untamed land. Before we begin our journey together, I want to thank you for being here. If you're enjoying these stories, a like or subscribe would mean so much. I'm always curious about our little communities scattered across the world. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Feel free to share in the comments. Now, settle into your most comfortable position, maybe adjust your pillows. Let your breathing slow and deepen, and allow yourself to drift back with me to another time, another place. Close your eyes now, and imagine waking up on a morning unlike any you've known before. You're waking up in the American Wild West of the 1870s. The good news is you're about to experience a legendary chapter of history firsthand. The challenging news is that your chances of survival have just changed dramatically. But don't worry, we're just visiting in our minds, safe and comfortable where we are now. The first thing you notice, even before you open your eyes, is the smell. It's not the earthy, pleasant aroma of nature you might expect. There's something far more pungent in the air. The stench of unwashed bodies mingles with animal droppings, and what might possibly be raw sewage hanging heavy around you. You see, bathing wasn't exactly a priority in the Wild West. Most settlers considered a thorough wash a monthly luxury, and that's being quite generous. Some went entire winters without a proper bath. Water, you understand, was precious out there in that vast landscape, and using it to clean yourself seemed wasteful when you needed it for drinking and cooking. As you slowly drag yourself from your bed, which is likely just a straw-filled mattress crawling with bed bugs, you realize how every muscle in your body aches. Life in the 1870s frontier involved constant physical labor from dawn until dusk. There were no weekends off, no vacations, and certainly no ergonomic considerations. Whether you were a farmer, miner, or ranch hand, your body was your primary tool, used until it broke down. You might think you work hard in your modern life, but frontier labor was something entirely different. Backbreaking work that left even the strongest people permanently hunched and arthritic by their 30s. Imagine spending 14 hours plowing fields, hauling water, chopping wood, or working deep underground in a mine shaft. No wonder the average lifespan was only about 35 years. Let that thought drift through your mind as you relax deeper into your pillow. Standing on the dusty floor of your imaginary cabin, you notice the chill in the air. If it's winter, your cabin might be 20 degrees below freezing inside. If you had a fireplace, you would have let it burn down overnight to save precious fuel. Good luck finding central heating or thermal underwear in this century. And if it's summer, well, get ready to sweat through every article of clothing you own. There was no escaping the elements in the Wild West. Speaking of clothing, forget comfort. Men typically own maybe 2 sets of clothes. Rough canvas or denim pants and cotton shirts that chafed against the skin. Women wore multiple layers regardless of the temperature. Chemises, corsets, petticoats, and long dresses that dragged in the dirt. Everything was scratchy, ill-fitting, and rarely cleaned. Those fancy outfits you've seen in Western movies were pure fiction for the average person. Your stomach growls, reminding you it's time for breakfast. Hope you like beans, biscuits, and coffee, possibly for every meal. The Wild West diet was monotonous and nutritionally deficient. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries. Meat, when available, was often preserved with salt or smoke because refrigeration didn't exist. Scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, when your gums bleed and your teeth fall out, was common among settlers despite being easily preventable with modern knowledge. You might think the coffee would at least be good. Cowboys always seem to have a pot brewing in the movies. But what you're served barely resembles what you'd recognize as coffee. It's typically boiled to within an inch of its life, bitter beyond belief, and might include crushed eggshells or even salt to reduce the bitterness. Still, the caffeine would help you face the day, so you drink it without complaint. Before heading outside, you might want to check your shoes for scorpions or snakes that could have sought shelter during the night. It wasn't uncommon for frontier folks to shake out their boots each morning, a habit born from painful experience. One wrong move, and you could be facing a venomous bite miles from any medical help. Stepping outside your cabin, you're immediately aware of how exposed you are. The vast landscape of the American frontier was breathtaking, sure, but it was also unforgiving. Extreme weather could appear with little warning. Blizzards, tornadoes, flash floods, or drought could all mean danger for the unprepared. The sky might be clear now, but that could change in minutes. If you settled in a frontier town, you might think civilization offers some protection. In some ways, that's true. In others, it just presents different challenges. Towns in the Wild West were hotbeds of disease. Without proper sewage systems or understanding of germ theory, illnesses spread rapidly through communities. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, diphtheria, and tuberculosis were constant threats. An outbreak could affect half a town in weeks. Let's say you decide to visit a town today. As you approach in your mind's eye, you notice there's a distinct lack of the organized layout you might expect. Many Western towns grew haphazardly, with buildings constructed wherever convenient, often without proper planning or infrastructure. The streets aren't paved, but are instead dirt tracks that transform into mud pits when it rains and dust bowls when it's dry. The smell hits you again, stronger now. Horse manure is everywhere because horses are the main transportation. There are no street cleaners or sanitation departments. In some towns, the accumulated waste could be knee-deep in heavily trafficked areas. Flies swarm around you, and you realize why disease spreads so easily here. As you walk down the main street in your imagination, you pass the saloon, likely one of the busiest establishments in town. Contrary to Hollywood depictions, saloons weren't glamorous places with swinging doors and piano players. Most were crude, one-room affairs with rough plank bars and basic furniture. The liquor served wasn't fine whiskey aged in oak barrels, but raw alcohol often mixed with tobacco juice, pepper, turpentine, or even gunpowder to give it extra kick. A single drink could harm you if you were unlucky. The saloon represents another aspect of frontier life: violence. These establishments were frequently sites of confrontations, not because of formal duels or showdowns, but because of arguments that escalated quickly in a heavily armed society. The romanticized gunfights of Western movies were rare. Most violence was impulsive, messy, and over trivial matters. Speaking of being armed, you'll notice almost everyone carries a weapon of some kind, but not for the reasons you might think. While personal protection was certainly a factor, weapons were primarily tools for hunting, protection from wildlife, and sometimes for signaling. The constant threat from bears, wolves, cougars, and venomous snakes made going unarmed foolish, especially when traveling between settlements. You might be surprised to learn that many frontier towns actually had strict gun control laws. Places like Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona, required visitors to surrender their firearms when entering town limits. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral actually started because the Clanton gang refused to comply with Tombstone's weapons ordinance. Despite what you've seen in movies, quick draw duels in the middle of the street were exceedingly rare. Most confrontations were sudden, chaotic, and lacked any sense of honor or fairness. As you continue your walk, you pass the local doctor's office. Medical care in the 1870s frontier would be quite shocking to modern sensibilities. Most doctors had little or no formal training. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia beyond whiskey or morphine, and sterilization was virtually unknown. Something as simple as an infected cut could lead to amputation or worse consequences. Common treatments included bloodletting, mercury compounds, arsenic, and other substances that often did more harm than good. Women in childbirth faced significant risks in remote areas. Dentistry involved extraction without anesthesia using crude tools. Most people suffered from painful dental issues for years before finally losing their teeth. If you were injured or fell ill on the frontier, your survival often depended more on luck than medical intervention. Even minor injuries could become serious due to infection. Broken bones might never heal properly, leaving frontier folk with chronic pain and disability. The famous phrase, "Only the strong survive," had literal meaning in the Wild West. Your stomach growls again, and you realize it's time for lunch. You head to the local restaurant, which is likely just an extension of someone's home where meals are served for a fee. The food isn't any more varied than your breakfast. Meat is tough and often on the edge of spoilage despite heavy smoking or salting. Vegetables, if available, are overcooked to mush. Food safety standards don't exist, so digestive troubles and food poisoning are common occurrences. While eating, you overhear conversations about recent troubles, outlaw gangs, or the danger of traveling alone. While violence was far less common than portrayed in popular culture, the frontier was still a place of conflict. The systematic displacement of indigenous peoples created tensions that sometimes erupted into violence on both sides. As for outlaws, they were a genuine concern, particularly in remote areas. Law enforcement was sparse, with a single sheriff sometimes responsible for thousands of square miles. In many places, justice was handled through vigilante action rather than formal legal proceedings. Communities sometimes took matters into their own hands, and the concept of innocent until proven guilty often didn't apply as it should have. After lunch, you decide to visit the local general store to stock up on supplies. The prices are quite surprising. Basic necessities cost far more on the frontier than back east due to the difficulty and expense of transportation. A simple can of peaches might cost the equivalent of $20 in today's money. Many settlers spent most of their income on essential supplies, with little left over for comfort or luxury. The store offers another glimpse into frontier reality, the isolation. Mail delivery was infrequent and unreliable. Newspapers might be weeks or months out of date. Information traveled slowly, and you might go years without news from family back east. Many settlers never saw their relatives again after moving west. The psychological toll of this isolation contributed to challenges among frontier populations. As the afternoon wears on, you notice dark clouds gathering on the horizon. Weather on the frontier wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be truly dangerous. Without modern forecasting, storms arrived with little warning. Blizzards could strand travelers. Tornadoes destroyed entire communities with no emergency services to assist survivors. Flash floods washed away wagon trains. Droughts ruined crops and caused food shortages. If you were lucky enough to have a proper home, it provided minimal protection. Most frontier dwellings were hastily constructed from whatever materials were available. Sod houses on the plains, log cabins in forested regions, or simple wooden structures in towns. None were particularly effective against extreme weather. Winter temperatures inside could drop below freezing. Summer heat was often unbearable, especially in attics or upper floors where many people slept. As the storm approaches, you decide to head back to your cabin before it hits. On the way, you pass a group of men heading to work at the local mine. Mining was one of the most challenging professions on the frontier. Underground cave-ins, toxic gas exposure, explosions from improperly handled blasting powder, and machinery accidents claimed countless lives. Miners also suffered from long-term health issues, like black lung from coal dust or mercury poisoning from gold processing. Even if you avoided mining, few frontier occupations were entirely safe. Farming involved dangerous equipment with no safety features. Ranching meant working with unpredictable animals weighing hundreds of pounds. Logging had one of the highest accident rates of any profession. Whatever you did to make a living, your risk of serious injury was exponentially higher than in the modern world. You make it back to your cabin just as the rain begins to fall. The roof leaks in several places, and you place buckets to catch the water. This is a good opportunity to refill your drinking water. Clean water was scarce and precious. Many frontier settlers drank from the same sources used for washing and watering livestock, leading to waterborne illnesses that could quickly become serious. As you sit in your leaky cabin listening to the rain, you reflect on how different reality is from the romanticized version of the Wild West. There were no simple heroes or villains, just people struggling to survive in incredibly harsh conditions. The fact that anyone made it through is testament to human resilience and determination. Nightfall comes early as you have no electricity. Candles and oil lamps provide minimal illumination, and you're careful with them. Fire was a constant danger in frontier homes. A single spark could mean losing everything with no fire department to call for help. Many towns burned to the ground at least once in their history. You prepare for bed, exhausted from just one day in the Wild West. Your muscles ache, your stomach is unsettled from the unfamiliar food, and your mind is overwhelmed by the constant vigilance required to stay safe. As you drift off to sleep, you wonder if you'll make it through tomorrow, or if you'll become just another story in the challenging tale of the American frontier. The wind howls outside your cabin, a haunting reminder of how small and vulnerable humans are against the vastness of the untamed wilderness. Tomorrow, if you're lucky enough to see it, will bring all these challenges again along with new ones you haven't yet imagined. In the Wild West, survival was never guaranteed. It was earned day by day, hour by hour, through hardship most modern people can scarcely comprehend. The morning light filters through the cracks in your cabin walls, waking you from a restless sleep. Your body aches from the hard mattress, but there's no time to linger. The Wild West waits for no one. As you rise, you remember yesterday's harsh introduction to frontier life and wonder what new challenges today will bring. Let's say you decide to leave town today to travel across the frontier. Whether you're heading to another settlement, joining a wagon train west, or simply exploring, travel in the 1870s was an entirely different experience than what you're used to. The good news is that by this time, the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed, connecting the east and west coasts of America. The challenging news is that unless you were relatively wealthy or traveling between major cities, you probably couldn't afford to use it. Most frontier folks traveled by horse, wagon, or simply on foot. If you owned a horse, consider yourself fortunate. Horses were expensive to buy and maintain, putting them out of reach for many settlers. A good horse might cost the equivalent of several months' wages. Then you needed saddles, bridles, feed, and veterinary care, though veterinary care often meant difficult decisions if an animal became seriously injured or developed certain illnesses. Riding itself was no pleasure cruise. Saddles in the 1870s weren't designed for comfort, but for function. Hours in the saddle left even experienced riders with blisters and aching muscles. And if your horse spooked at a snake or sudden noise, which happened frequently, you could easily be thrown, potentially suffering broken bones miles from any help. If you couldn't afford a horse, you might travel by wagon. Forget the romantic image of pioneers cheerfully rolling across pristine prairies. Wagon travel was brutally uncomfortable. The vehicles had no suspension system beyond the slight give in wooden wheels, meaning you felt every rock, rut, and hole in the trail. The constant jarring caused wagon sickness similar to seasickness, leaving travelers nauseous and miserable. Roads, if they existed at all, were typically just dirt tracks carved by previous travelers. After rain, they became muddy quagmires where wagons could sink axle deep. During dry periods, the dust was so thick you could barely breathe or see. Wagons frequently broke down with wheels cracking or axles snapping miles from the nearest settlement. Let's say you've decided to journey all the way to California or Oregon. You've joined a wagon train heading west on the famous Oregon Trail. This 2,000-mile journey was one of the most perilous undertakings of the 19th century. Of the approximately 400,000 people who attempted it between the 1840s and 1860s, an estimated 1 in 10 didn't survive. The Oregon Trail was sometimes called the nation's longest graveyard. Some historians estimate that an average of 10 to 15 people passed away for every mile of the trail. Think about that for a moment. A grave every 350 feet or so for 2,000 miles. The trail was lined with makeshift crosses and stone markers, many without names, as families were forced to bury loved ones and continue their journey. Disease was the #1 challenge on the Oregon Trail. Cholera, a bacterial infection spread through contaminated water, was particularly devastating. This illness caused severe diarrhea and vomiting, draining the body of fluid so quickly that a person could be healthy at breakfast and seriously ill by dinner. There was no effective treatment available. Wagon trains would sometimes lose dozens of people in a single cholera outbreak. Other diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and mountain fever claimed countless lives. Children were especially vulnerable, with many families losing multiple children during the journey. Medical care was rudimentary at best, often consisting of folk remedies that did little to help and sometimes made conditions worse. Crossing rivers presented another significant challenge. Wagons weren't designed to float, but pioneers had to cross numerous rivers on their journey west. Some had ferries or fords, but many required the wagon to be floated across like a makeshift boat. Wagons frequently capsized in these crossings, resulting in the loss of people, livestock, and precious supplies. The Platte, Columbia, and Snake Rivers claimed hundreds of lives during the migration period. Contrary to popular belief, attacks by Native Americans were relatively rare. Most tribes were actually helpful to migrants, offering supplies, guidance, and assistance with river crossings. The majority of violent incidents on the trail came from accidents, being crushed by wagon wheels, drowning, or being kicked by draft animals. Firearms accidents were shockingly common, as most travelers were inexperienced with weapons, but carried them for hunting and protection. The psychological toll of the journey was immense. Families buried children, parents, and spouses along the way, then had to continue traveling immediately. There was no time for extended grief on the trail. Each day's delay meant less chance of crossing the mountains before winter snows made passes impossible. The constant stress, grief, and physical hardship led many travelers to mental breakdown. Despair was not uncommon among trail migrants. If you somehow survived the journey to California or Oregon, your challenges weren't over. Many arrived at their destination having spent all their money and resources on the journey itself. Families often arrived impoverished, malnourished, and ill, only to find that the promised land had its own harsh realities. But let's say you've decided not to travel that far. Perhaps you're heading to a nearby town or settlement instead. Even short journeys in the Wild West presented significant challenges. Travelers might encounter outlaws who saw lone riders or small groups as easy targets. While the frequency of stagecoach robberies was exaggerated in later fiction, they did occur regularly enough to be a legitimate concern. The natural environment posed constant threats to travelers. Flash floods could wash out trails or trap unwary travelers. Summer heat in desert regions could cause dehydration and heat stroke. Winter blizzards routinely trap travelers, sometimes leading to freezing conditions or desperate situations like the infamous Donner Party, where survivors resorted to extreme measures to stay alive. Navigation itself was challenging in an era before detailed maps. Travelers relied on vague directions, landmarks that could change or be misidentified, and the experience of guides who sometimes proved unreliable. Getting lost in the wilderness could be a serious situation, especially if your supplies ran low. As you travel today in your imagination, you notice another aspect of frontier life that movies rarely depict accurately: the stunning diversity of people. The Wild West wasn't populated solely by one type of person. It was a meeting ground of cultures from around the world. Chinese immigrants worked as railroad builders, miners, and merchants. Mexican families had been living in the Southwest long before it became United States territory. Black cowboys made up as much as 25% of the workforce on some ranches. European immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Italy, and Scandinavia brought their cultures and traditions. And of course, dozens of distinct Native American nations had called these lands home for thousands of years before others arrived. This diversity, however, didn't mean equality or harmony. Challenges based on race and origin were common features of frontier life. Chinese railroad workers faced brutal discrimination and were often forced to take the most dangerous jobs for lower pay than others. Mexican landowners frequently saw their property seized through legal manipulation or outright theft after the Mexican-American War. Black Americans who moved west hoping to escape Southern discrimination often found frontier prejudice just as entrenched, if different in form. Despite their crucial contributions to ranching, mining, and building frontier communities, they were frequently excluded from economic opportunities and social acceptance. For Native Americans, the expansion of settlement was nothing short of catastrophic. The indigenous population of North America, once numbering perhaps 15 million people, had been reduced to fewer than 300,000 by 1900. Disease, warfare, forced relocation, and the deliberate destruction of their food sources, particularly the buffalo, decimated numerous tribes and nations. Government policies systematically pushed Native Americans from their traditional lands onto reservations, often in areas with poor soil and few resources. Treaties were regularly broken when valuable resources were discovered on reservation lands. Native children were taken from their families and placed in boarding schools designed to erase their cultural identity, operating under the philosophy of "kill the Indian, save the man." The romanticized cowboys versus Indians narratives of later films grossly misrepresented the complex interactions between settlers and indigenous peoples. Many native nations initially tried to accommodate newcomers and adapt to changing circumstances. Violence typically erupted after repeated treaty violations, encroachment on tribal lands, or deliberate provocations. As you continue your journey, you ponder another group whose experience differed markedly from Hollywood depictions: women on the frontier. Far from the helpless characters of Western movies, frontier women performed incredibly demanding physical labor while navigating restrictive social expectations. On homesteads and farms, women not only handled traditional domestic duties like cooking, cleaning, childcare, and making clothing, but also worked in the fields, tended livestock, and defended the home when necessary. Their workday typically started before dawn and ended well after dark with few, if any, days of rest. A frontier woman might need to plow fields in the morning, deliver a neighbor's baby at midday, protect livestock from predators in the afternoon, and still prepare meals and care for her own children throughout. Many women became widows young due to the dangerous nature of frontier life and had to manage farms or businesses alone while raising children. Despite their essential contributions, women had few legal rights. In most territories and states, they couldn't vote, own property independently if married, or have custody of their children in the event of divorce. Domestic violence was considered a private matter with little legal recourse available to victims. For unmarried women, options were severely limited. Teaching was one of the few respectable professions, though female teachers were paid significantly less than their male counterparts and were often expected to resign upon marriage. Some women found economic independence through running boarding houses, working as nurses, or establishing millinery or dressmaking businesses. Then, there were the women who worked in frontier brothels and saloons. While later mythology romanticized these women, the reality was typically grim. Many entered the profession out of economic desperation after being widowed or abandoned. Physical abuse, drug addiction, and venereal disease were common hazards of the work. Even those who managed to earn substantial money found themselves socially ostracized and unable to transition to more respectable positions. Some women did find greater freedom on the frontier than they might have back east. The shortage of women in Western territories gave them more marriage options, and sometimes better treatment as communities competed to attract and keep female residents. A few territories, like Wyoming and Utah, granted women voting rights decades before the 19th Amendment, recognizing their essential contributions to frontier development. As the day wears on, and you continue traveling in your mind, you might wonder about law enforcement in this supposedly lawless land. The reality was complex and varied widely by location. Major cities and towns typically had some form of organized law enforcement, but vast rural areas had minimal, if any, official protection. County sheriffs were elected officials responsible for maintaining order across sometimes enormous territories. A single sheriff might be the only law enforcement for thousands of square miles, making regular patrols impossible. They relied heavily on deputizing ordinary citizens during emergencies, creating posses to pursue criminals or respond to violence. Town marshals handled law enforcement within town limits, sometimes with a few deputies in larger settlements. These positions were often dangerous and poorly paid, attracting a mix of dedicated public servants and those who enjoyed the power the badge provided. Some famous lawmen like Wyatt Earp moved between legitimate law enforcement and more questionable enterprises throughout their careers. Federal marshals had jurisdiction throughout territories and states, but were few in number. They typically focused on major crimes like counterfeiting, mail robbery, or offenses involving multiple jurisdictions. The legendary marshals of Western movies, single-handedly bringing law to lawless towns, were largely fictional creations. In many remote areas, justice was handled through informal community action rather than official legal processes. Vigilante groups formed to address perceived threats when formal law enforcement was absent or ineffective. Sometimes these groups maintained basic order, but they could easily become vehicles for prejudice, personal vendettas, or mob violence. The iconic image of the quick-draw gunfight was largely a later invention. Most frontier violence was mundane, impulsive, and often alcohol-fueled. Bar fights that escalated to dangerous levels, domestic violence, and disputes over land or livestock were far more common than dramatic shootouts on dusty streets. Criminal punishment was harsh by modern standards. Hanging was the standard penalty for murder, and sometimes theft, particularly of horses or cattle. Prisons existed but were primitive facilities with high mortality rates from disease, violence, and poor conditions. Many communities preferred immediate execution to the expense of long-term imprisonment. As evening approaches, you decide to seek shelter for the night. If you're lucky, you might find a town with a hotel or boarding house. Don't expect luxury. Frontier accommodations were basic at best. A typical hotel room would have a simple bed, possibly infested with bed bugs, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and perhaps a chair. Bathroom facilities would be an outhouse in the back shared by all guests. Privacy was minimal with thin walls allowing you to hear your neighbor's every movement and conversation. In busier establishments, you might even share a bed with a stranger, a common practice to maximize capacity during busy periods. The sheets might not have been changed for previous guests, and lighting would be limited to candles or oil lamps. A night's lodging would cost between 25 cents and $1, depending on the establishment's quality and location. This represented a significant expense for many travelers, equivalent to several hours' wages for an average worker. Many chose to sleep in stables, barns, or simply under the stars to save money despite the additional risks these options presented. If you were traveling through more remote areas, you'd likely camp for the night. This meant building a fire, assuming you could find enough fuel, preparing a meal from your limited supplies, and sleeping on the ground with minimal protection from the elements or wildlife. Indigenous peoples, experienced travelers, and military scouts had sophisticated techniques for safe camping, but the average settler often made dangerous mistakes. Proper fire management was literally a matter of life and survival. A fire built too large could spark a prairie or forest fire that could consume thousands of acres in hours. One built too small might not provide enough warmth during cold nights, leading to hypothermia. Campfire cooking required skills most modern people lack, often resulting in meals that were simultaneously burnt and raw. As night falls fully, and you prepare to sleep, the sounds of the frontier darkness surround you. Coyotes howl in the distance. Unfamiliar birds call. The wind whispers through grass or trees. For people accustomed to modern light and noise, the profound darkness and strange sounds of wilderness nights often triggered intense anxiety. Many travelers slept poorly on the frontier, not just because of physical discomfort, but from fear of the unknown dangers that might lurk in the darkness. Attacks, though rare, often occurred at dawn when sleepers were at their most vulnerable. Predators like wolves, bears, and mountain lions might investigate camps looking for food. Venomous snakes and scorpions sought warm places to rest, sometimes including a sleeper's bedroll. Even if no actual threats materialized, the psychological stress of constant vigilance took its toll. Frontier diaries frequently mention exhaustion, not just from physical labor, but from the mental strain of perpetual alertness. Modern people accustomed to locks, alarms, and the security of dense population would find the vulnerability of frontier sleeping arrangements profoundly disturbing. As you drift towards sleep in your imagination, you reflect on the day's journey. Travel in the Wild West bears almost no resemblance to its sanitized, romanticized portrayal in later entertainment. It was grueling, challenging, and uncomfortable beyond what most modern people could endure. The skills required, from navigation without maps to making emergency repairs to handling firearms safely, took years to develop, and mistakes were often serious. The darkness deepens, and the sounds of night creatures grow louder around you in this imaginary frontier night. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. If you survive the night in this mental journey, perhaps you'll reach your destination. Or perhaps you'll simply wake up safe in your own comfortable bed, grateful for the softness of your pillow and the security of your modern home. The Wild West offered no second chances. Every day survived was a victory against overwhelming odds. But here, in the safety of your imagination, you can experience it all, and then drift peacefully back to your own time, your own place. The new day dawns on the frontier, and you've somehow survived the night in your imagination. A small victory in itself in the Wild West. As you rub the sleep from your eyes and stretch your aching muscles, you contemplate what direction your frontier experience might take today. Perhaps you'll try your luck in one of the booming mining towns where fortunes were supposedly made overnight. You've heard stories of the California gold rush, the Nevada silver strikes, and the Colorado mining booms. Tales of ordinary men finding nuggets the size of chicken eggs and becoming wealthy overnight drew hundreds of thousands west. What these stories don't mention are the harsh realities awaiting those who chase mineral dreams. Let's say you decide to try your hand at mining. What would that actually entail? First, you'd need to stake a claim, which means finding unclaimed land with potential mineral deposits, increasingly difficult by the 1870s, as the easiest and richest areas were claimed years earlier. If you were lucky enough to find a promising spot, you'd need to register your claim at the nearest government office and pay the required fees, which could be substantial. Then the real work would begin, and it was some of the most physically demanding labor imaginable. For placer mining, searching for loose gold in streams, you'd spend hours bent over in ice-cold mountain water, sifting through sediment with a pan or sluice box. Your hands would crack and bleed from constant exposure to water and rough materials. Your back would ache from the hunched position. And after all that effort, you'd be lucky to find a few tiny flakes of gold worth pennies. If you ventured into hard rock mining, digging for veins of ore in the mountains, the dangers multiplied exponentially. Tunneling into unstable rock without modern safety equipment or engineering knowledge led to frequent cave-ins that crushed miners where they stood. Poorly ventilated shafts filled with toxic gases like carbon monoxide, odorless but deadly, suffocating miners who had no warning of the danger. Blasting with black powder or dynamite to break through rock was incredibly hazardous. Miners frequently lost fingers, hands, eyes, or their lives when charges detonated prematurely, or when rock fragments became deadly projectiles. The thunderous noise and constant percussion of blasting left many with permanent hearing loss. Even if you avoided immediate catastrophes, the long-term health effects were devastating. Miners constantly inhaled fine rock dust leading to silicosis, a painful lung disease that slowly suffocated its victims. Mercury used in gold processing caused neurological damage, tremors, and mental deterioration. Those working in copper or lead mines absorbed toxic metals that accumulated in their bodies, causing chronic illness and early decline. The mining industry of the 1870s had virtually no safety regulations or oversight. Mine owners prioritized profit over worker welfare, and injuries were considered an expected part of the job. Medical care for injured miners was minimal and often ineffective. A serious injury typically meant the end of a miner's career and livelihood, with no disability support or workers' compensation available. For all these risks and hardships, what was the likely reward? Despite the mythology of the lucky prospector, the vast majority of miners barely earned subsistence wages. By the 1870s, most worked for large mining companies rather than independently, earning $2 to $3 for a grueling 10 to 12-hour day. Studies suggest that storekeepers, saloon owners, and others consistently made more money than the miners whose dreams sustained frontier mining towns. Speaking of mining towns, they were notoriously rough places. Imagine a community composed primarily of young single men engaged in dangerous work with few women, families, or civilizing institutions. Alcohol consumption was astronomical. The average mining camp resident consumed several times more alcohol than the typical American today. Violence was commonplace with fights, stabbings, and shootings occurring regularly. Sanitation in mining camps was typically abysmal with minimal planning or infrastructure. Human waste and garbage accumulated in streets and waterways. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery spread rapidly in these conditions. During warm months, the stench could be overwhelming and swarms of flies spread disease from waste to food. If you managed to find valuable ore, you faced the challenge of converting it to cash. Banking in the Wild West was primitive and often predatory. Many mining towns had no banks at all, forcing miners to carry gold dust or ore, making them targets for theft. Some saloons and general stores offered to buy gold, but frequently at rates far below actual value, taking advantage of miners' limited options. Where banks did exist, they operated with minimal regulation or oversight. Bank failures were common, often wiping out customers' life savings without warning or recourse. Many bankers were little more than confidence men who established storefronts, collected deposits, and disappeared overnight with all the funds. Without federally backed currency, Paper money was issued by individual banks, and its value fluctuated wildly depending on the bank's reputation. Counterfeit bills circulated widely, and even experienced merchants could be fooled by well-made fakes. The safest form of money was gold or silver coin, but carrying it made one a target for robbery. Perhaps after considering the challenges and disappointments of mining, you decide to try your hand at ranching instead. The cattle industry was booming as frontier life unfolded. Survival depended on learning countless practical skills. People had to read the weather by watching clouds and wind. They learned how to track animals, prepare soil for planting, treat common injuries, and solve problems without outside help. Every day demanded knowledge passed down through experience rather than formal education. Yet even with these skills, life remained fragile. Child mortality was devastatingly high throughout the frontier period. Nearly 1 in 4 children died before reaching adulthood, with the greatest risk during the first 5 years of life. Diseases that modern medicine now prevents or treats with ease were often fatal. Measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough. These illnesses routinely killed or permanently disabled young children. Accidents claimed many more lives. Child safety, as we understand it today, did not exist. Survival required constant risk-taking, and children were expected to participate fully in daily labor. The psychological impact of this constant loss is difficult for modern people to imagine. Most children grew up watching siblings die. Parents expected loss. It was common to give the same name to a newborn if an older child had died young, a practice that feels unsettling today, but reflected a world where death was an everyday presence rather than a distant possibility. Nothing illustrates the divide between frontier life and modern life more clearly than health and medicine. If you became ill or injured in the American West during the 1870s, your experience would bear little resemblance to modern health care. Doctors were scarce. Many communities had none at all. Those who did practice medicine often had minimal training, perhaps a short apprenticeship or a few months at a medical college. Their knowledge was rooted in outdated theories, such as humoral balance, ideas closer to medieval medicine than modern science. Without professional care, most health issues were treated at home. Every community had individuals, often women, known for their healing knowledge. They relied on folk remedies and traditions drawn from many cultures. Some herbal treatments were genuinely effective. Many others were useless or actively harmful. Common medical practices included bloodletting, which weakened already ill patients. Powerful purgatives caused severe diarrhea, meant to expel bad humors. Poultices were applied to wounds, sometimes introducing infection rather than preventing it. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was widely used for pain and discomfort. Addiction was common. Mercury compounds were prescribed for a range of ailments, despite their toxicity. Even when treatments were theoretically sound, medications were impure. There were no pharmaceutical standards, or regulations. Commercial medicines varied wildly in strength and often contained dangerous contaminants. Many patent medicines advertised as cures were mostly alcohol. They dulled pain and anxiety temporarily, without addressing the underlying illness. Surgery on the frontier was especially brutal. Effective anesthesia did not exist beyond alcohol, opium, or whiskey. Patients endured extreme pain during procedures. Sterilization was unknown or inconsistently practiced, leading to widespread infection. Amputation was the standard treatment for severe limb injuries. It was performed quickly, with saws and knives that might be wiped clean but never properly sterilized. Childbirth revealed perhaps the starkest contrast between frontier life and the modern world. Women usually gave birth at home. If available, a midwife attended. Otherwise, female relatives helped as best they could. Without prenatal care, complications often went unnoticed until labor began. Breech births, hemorrhage, and infections frequently resulted in death of the mother, the child, or both. Maternal mortality rates were approximately 1 death per 100 births, more than 100 times higher than in developed nations today. Many women approached each pregnancy knowing it might be their last. Men's diaries from the period often describe the heartbreak of raising children alone after losing wives in childbirth. The combined effects of poor nutrition, constant physical strain, lack of preventive care, and primitive medical treatment meant frontier populations experienced health outcomes closer to those of modern developing nations than modern America. Life expectancy at birth was under 40 years. Those who survived childhood often developed chronic health problems by middle age, if they lived that long. Beyond physical hardship, frontier life imposed deep isolation. Communication moved only as fast as physical travel. Letters took weeks or months to arrive, if they arrived at all. News traveled slowly and often inaccurately. Major events might remain unknown in remote areas for months. This isolation shaped frontier psychology. Women, especially those raised in settled communities, often endured intense loneliness. Husbands might be gone for days or weeks seeking supplies or work. Diaries frequently mention the strain of having no adult conversation for long stretches of time. Some individuals developed what was then called prairie madness, severe depression, anxiety, and sometimes psychosis brought on by isolation, exhaustion, and environmental stress. Some became violent. Some took their own lives. Others abandoned their homesteads and returned east. Even in established towns, social life was limited. Visiting neighbors could require traveling miles on foot or horseback. Formal gatherings were rare and centered on churches, seasonal celebrations, or shared labor like barn raisings. Churches served many roles beyond religion. They functioned as schools, social centers, and mutual aid organizations. Religious leaders often acted as teachers, mediators, and organizers. The building of schools, churches, and meeting halls marked a transition from temporary settlement to permanent community. Mutual aid was essential. Families worked together to raise barns, harvest crops, and search for missing children. Despite later myths of rugged individualism, survival depended on cooperation. As night falls, you reflect on the resilience required to endure such a life. The people of the frontier were not superhuman. They suffered. They struggled. Some broke under the pressure, but many adapted. They found meaning, and sometimes even joy, amid relentless hardship. Darkness settles over the land once more. The silence deepens. And slowly, gently, sleep begins to arrive.